Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1649. And we will today continue for you patient listeners and viewers, Life, Death by Jacques Derrida. And we are presently at page 65 in the English translation. Wow. 65, and we're just under the quote. And we've been talking about the will and how everything that is permanent, persistent, endurable, forceful, alive, eternal, always have double-sidedness. This is something we took up around 300 episodes ago when we discussed Heraclitus. Heraclitus had a keen understanding for opposition and how they make for strength, organization. This is also something from chaos theory. Chaos theory, all from the galaxies. Galaxies, the biggest structure in the universe, are built from oppositions. Without it, they would disappear, evaporate. Similarity is death to everything. Sameness. Not a single fragment in a galaxy is the same. They all have different directions. Dissimilarity builds what is endurable, strong, directed. Evil could be said to be that one-sidedness, sameness. Might Nietzsche call it weakness or rigidity? His criticism of Darwin is because luck is no longer a part. Everything is like Darwin is a big accountant. Everything is counted in advance. Chance is no longer liveliness, creativity, the human soul, which is built out of chance. The living human being with his soul is contradictory as same at the same time. I begin the reading of the text. We are just under the citation, the second paragraph. That chance works toward the elimination of strokes of luck is also recalled in the other fragment entitled anti-Darwin. We have convinced ourselves, conversely, that in the struggle for existence, chance serves the weak as well as the strong. That cunning often substitutes advantageously for force. That the fruitfulness of the species stands in a notable relation to its chances for destruction. It is indeed all the more surprising that the cunning that substitutes for force in this way, coming therefore as weakness in the place of force, is also defined elsewhere, just as dissimulation is as what is proper to superior force. And this relation of substitution of the less strong for the stronger, of the dead for the living, as well as this relation between the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest morality of destructibility. Are relations for which the usual logic of relations between life and death have difficulty providing an explanation. It is this logic that is of interest here. Finally, a third remark. Everything that beginning in 1872 calls into question the usual relations between concept and metaphor, truth and metaphor, etc., and that reconstructs this problematic as one of selective reproduction. All that is very consistent and indeed literally consistent with what is said in the lectures on the future. The extension of culture and, as we would say, equal opportunity are condemned by Nietzsche as the greatest risk for the highest forces of culture. Could we please have the text a little bit higher up? Hence, Nietzsche does not just speak metaphorically or speak about metaphor. He defines genius, the very thing that culture must produce or facilitate, and to which education itself, that which education must itself conform as a living metaphor. A living metaphor of what? Well, of life, or again, another name for life, of the mother, or of this mother that the unconscious of a people is. Whether this is to be taken metaphorically or properly, one can no longer say it is this life, this unconscious, this genius, this mother that must be saved from the expansion of science, from the number of institutions, from death, therefore from science, consciousness, fathers, and so on. Here's the passage. The education of the masses cannot, therefore, be our aim, but rather the education of a few select men for great and lasting works. We well know that a just posterity judges the collective cultural achievement of a time only by those few great and lonely figures of the period. And it casts its vote in accordance with the manner in which these figures are recognized, encouraged, and honored, or else snubbed, elbowed aside, and destroyed. What is called the education of the masses cannot be accomplished directly. And even if a system of universal, elementary, compulsory education is applied, it can succeed only extrinsically. And after having shown that the unconscious of the people in all its depth cannot be reached by these direct paths, but by respecting a certain healthy slumber, he continues. We know, however, what the aspiration is of those who would disturb the healthy slumber of the people, and continually call out to them, keep your eyes open, be sensible, be wise. We know the aim of those who profess to satisfy excessive educational requirements by means of an extraordinary increase in the number of educational institutions and the conceited tribe of teachers produced by the system. These very people, using these very means, are fighting against the natural hierarchy in the realm of the intellect. And destroying the roots of all those noble and sublime plastic forces which have their maternal origin in the unconsciousness of the people. And which fittingly terminate in the procreation of genius and its due guidance and proper training. It is only in the simile of the mother that we can grasp the meaning and the responsibility of true education of the people. Its real origin is not to be found in such education. It has, so to speak, only a metaphysical source. A metaphysical home. but for the genius to make his appearance, for him to emerge from among the people, to portray the reflected picture. As it were, the dazzling brilliance of the peculiar colors of this people, to depict the noble destiny of a people in the similitude of an individual, in a work which will last for all time, thereby making his nation itself eternal and redeeming it from the ever-shifting element of transient things. All this is possible for the genius only when he has been brought up and come to maturity in the mother's lap of the culture of the people. While, on the other hand, without this sheltering home, the genius will not, generally speaking, be able to rise to the height of his eternal flight, but will, at an early moment, like a stranger, weather-driven, upon a bleak, snow-covered desert, slink away from the inhospitable land. You astonish me with such a metaphysics of genius, said the teacher's companion, and I have only a hazy conception of the accuracy of your simile. On the one hand, I fully understand what you have said about the surplus of public schools and the corresponding surplus of high-level teachers. Life, the mother, and genius are here. Through the unconscious of a culture of the people, situated metaphorically, each being a metaphor of the other. And genius is always unique. The singular metaphorical representative of the unconscious, or the mother, or the life that is most living. This unicity counts, and everything must work with the unique in view. Let me mention to you, not knowing exactly how to treat this biographical reference, which to my knowledge, neither Nietzsche nor his biographers ever evoke. That not only was Nietzsche a unique son, but the year following the death of his father, his brother, 4 years younger than he, also died. It would be hard to maintain, however. One interprets it that when Nietzsche says, I am too, he, the dead, and she, the living. The dead father and the living mother. I am a double. It would be hard to maintain that the figure of the brother is not silently at work in this mise en scène. In a real way and according to the form of the enigma. We will have to return, of course, to this entire problematic of metaphor in its relation to reproduction selection, in its relation to knowledge, concepts, and truth. What is nonetheless already certain is that on the basis of such a problematic, one should no longer be able or should no longer have been able to consider as certain the limit, the rigorous cut between a metaphor and a concept. And singularly so in the domain of life or biological science. Now, what first strikes me when I read philosophers or epistemologists of life, such as tangle them is that when they get around, inevitably, to questioning the introduction of metaphors in the field in which they work, it is in order to maintain at all costs the rigorous and reassuring border between the conceptual and the metaphorically. What also strikes me is that, to my knowledge, they never cite Nietzsche and do not take him into account. What strikes me as well, and this is intriguing and interesting, is that they implicitly think that to meddle with a rigorous border between concept and metaphor is to comprise scientific objectivity, something that no self-respecting scientist should be willing to do, since that is what actually turns science into scientism. What strikes me as well, and what seems to me intriguing and interesting, is that in order to avoid meddling, one refrains from any question regarding the metaphoricity of metaphor and the conceptuality of the concept. And one forbids oneself from tampering in any way with their respective order, without suspecting that science, far from suffering from an erasure of the limit, might, on the contrary, demand a recasting of this division and of the law of this division. Finally, what strikes me and seems to me intriguing, interesting, is that by keeping intact, by wanting to preserve at all cost the traditional opposition between metaphor and concept, one prevents oneself not just from understanding anything about the actual history of science, but also, and that this needs no demonstration, from making the slightest contribution to it. In white theology, no, in white mythology, sorry, I try to explain myself on this point with regard to Bachelard. Let's see how things stand with Canguilhem. In the text that we began to read last time, let me pick it up at the point where he mentions Claude Bernard, whose work I note in passing, Nietzsche knew, which is not insignificant, and quoted, for example, in Will to Power. At that moment, he was underscoring that health and sickness are not essentially different, that they are not distinct entities that would fight over the living organism as on a battlefield. To say this would be silly nonsense and chatter. Between sickness and health, there are only differences in degree. It is the exaggeration, disproportion, and disharmony of normal phenomena that constitute the morbid state. See Claude Bernard, says Nietzsche. Thus, I pick up Canguilhem's The Concept and Life at the point where it is discussing Claude Bernard and the metaphor. I wish to highlight right from the start the opposition that Canguilhem seems to consider assured, founded, and untouchable. It is the opposition between what he calls, therefore, metaphor and what he calls an adequate concept. Here are two quotations to underscore an opposition that is never questioned by him, much less put in doubt, that is not even subject to the most tentative re-elaboration. First, page 358. If genetic information is defined as the coded program of the synthesis of proteins, then can we not maintain that the following terms, all coming from Claude Bernard, and which are used not just once and by chance, but constantly throughout his work, instructional sign, guiding idea, vital design, vital preordination, vital plan, meaning of phenomena are so many attempts to define in absence of adequate concepts and through the convergence of metaphors, a biological fact that is in some sense designated before being attained. In other words, the convergence of metaphors come in the place where the adequate concept is lacking. In the absence of the adequate concept, what Cangelhem here implies is not that the adequate concept is always lacking, and that concepts are never anything but metaphors, or that concepts are already metaphors, but that we have today an adequate concept where Bernard had to make do with metaphors. Second quotation. Message, information, program, code, instruction, decoding. Such are the new concepts of the knowledge of life. But one will object, are not these concepts ultimately imported metaphors, reminiscent of the way Claude Bernard, through a convergence of metaphors, sought to make up for the lack of an adequate concept? Apparently, yes, but in fact, no. For what guarantees the theoretical effectiveness or the cognitive value of a concept is its operational function. Before going any further in our reading, one can already acknowledge that for Cangelhem, the adequation of a concept is not, as it is traditionally understood, a value that is measured against the more or less contemplative awareness of a correlation between a thought and an object in a judgment, in an adequatio intellectus ad rem. What he calls with these more or less well-chosen words, adequate concept, must be understood in its working concept. and that is its practical function. In theoretical practice, and that is why Cangelam also speaks of theoretical effectiveness, or of operational function. An adequate concept is, for him, an effective concept, one that facilitates scientific work, that causes this work to advance and does not hinder it. After having said operational function, he adds and clarifies, and thus the possibility it offers for the development and progress of knowledge. Have we, by means of this practicist, operational definition of the adequate concept or of adequation, made any real progress in the problem that concerns us? Let me first remark, and this cannot be just a formal question of vocabulary, that it is odd to speak of an adequate concept in order to designate a concept that has a value of practical mobilization in the movement and progress of knowledge. Inadequation is just as mobilizing as adequation. As Cangelam, in fact, would no doubt be willing to acknowledge in other contexts. And adequation, when taken literary, can be rather static and immobilizing. What Cangelam seems to want to say, if we are to do everything possible here to validate his claim, is that the adequation of which he speaks is no longer that of a concept to a thing or an object, but the adequation, the right relation between a conceptual system or network and the theoretical situation within a given field at a given moment of the scientific process. But even with this clarification, the problem remains. It seems to me completely intact, yea, I say. Cangelham wants to hold on to this distinction between adequate concept and metaphor. It is not my intention to remain at the level of a formal critique that would simply note, for example, that adequation to a movement or to a process, adequation as what allows for the progress of knowledge, is like all adequation to a movement, inadequate, and that it can be productive only to the extent that there is a certain inadequate adequation. Hooray. Or else that this inadequate adequation is also what is proper, if one can still say this to every metaphor, which makes the limit between concepts and metaphors very uncertain, or else that this opposition between the adequate concept, whatever transformation it might undergo, and the metaphor presupposes at the very last a horizon of propriety, of proper knowledge, one that belongs to a very determinate field and to an earlier stage of philosophical discourse, and particularly the discourse of philosophy with regard to science. Instead of simply remaining at this level of argumentation, which would be sufficient, I believe, but remains formal, I would like to put it to the test of the content itself of Cangelham's text, the material he's treating. And there I will take quotes. It's way too interesting to continue. Rather a tasty text, to say the least. A lot of outtakes here, especially at the very end. I think I would focus on one theme here. Page 66, the third session. it into the sentence, there are relations for which the usual logic of relations between life and death will have difficulty providing an explanation. That is very true and extremely pertinent to understand. Here we have instead the Heraclitean logic. It is this logic that is of interest here. Do remember that this is the same as Graham Priest's paraconsistent logic. It's the logic of the world. Page 67, the 12th line. Just a little hint here, not super important. It is only in the simile, Gleichnisse of the mother, that we can grasp the meaning and the responsibility of the true education of people in respect to genius. Its real origin is not to be found in such education. Here we have a hint to simile. And from simile, we pass on to metaphor. Yes, the whole sentence is great. Its real origin is not to be found. It has, so to speak, only a metaphysical source, a metaphysical home. We continue on page 68. And we must remember here, Cangelhem once more comes into the action. And that's a bit down, third paragraph, very small paragraphs here. Do remember, Cangelhem is not here as Cangelhem, but what he represents. Derrida is not interested in deconstruction Cangelhem. It is for the text. It serves a purpose. Cangelhem, of course, is not the only one. This is how we do things. And it's about how Cangelhem and all others defend themselves against metaphoricity. To question the introduction of metaphors in the field in which they work, it is in the order to maintain at all costs the rigorous and reassuring border between the conceptual and the metaphorical. This is exactly what it's about. In a nutshell, there is a defense against the metaphor. Your marker is exactly on the site now. That's where it is. And further down, yeah, thank you very much. Further down, we find another mentioning that is about 12 lines, 10 lines from the bottom. One refrains from any question regarding the metaphoricity of metaphor and the conceptuality of of the concept, and one forbids oneself from tampering in any way with their respective order. And that's enough. The division needs to be upheld, or the perceived division, I would say. Perceived by the scientist in the Cangelham likeness. And later down we have at the very last sentence, and I will read the whole one. Finally, what strikes me and seems to be to me intriguing, interesting, is that by keeping intact, by wanting to preserve at all costs the traditional opposition between metaphor and concept, one prevents oneself not just from understanding anything about the actual history of science, but also, and this needs no demonstration, from making the slightest contribution to it. It's the death of knowledge to cast out metaphoricity, to cast out the untruth, to cast out the ambivalence. The oppositions is killing the truth, is making it deaf, dumb, mute. Is the only destructive tendency in the universe. There are no other. And then we have a rather long one. This is getting a bit too long here. 69. We have a quote, and I will not read all of it because it's dragging on a bit. It's the second paragraph, the quote, and it's mentioning here, and I will just do a retake. It's not so quotable, but the zest of it is that Claude Bernard had to make do with metaphors. And here are some examples of what later become to be concepts. And then we have the revealment. Page 70. Message, information, program, code, instruction, decoding. Such are the new concepts of the knowledge of life. But one will object, are not these concepts ultimately, comes suspicion here, ultimately important metaphors, reminiscent on the way Claude Bernard, through a convergence of metaphor, sought to make up for the lack of adequate concepts. Apparently, yes, but in fact, no. For what guarantees the theoretical effectiveness or the cognitive value of a concept is its operational function. He is here revealing his tendency, his move, what he's pointing to. Cast out the metaphor. Get rid of it. And thereby he is revealing he is not true to the cause. He is not interested in bringing knowledge to the core. It is this fixation of one-sidedness, of the true concept that directly connects to an object, not indirectly or almost poetically, like a metaphor that cannot be trusted to bring static, fixated, monosemic truth. And therefore, he claims that message, information, program has only one meaning. He's falling into the same trap as Gödel. He's ignoring meaning. He's ignoring the liveliness of the world and language. And of course, it's not neither Bernard or Cangelhem. It is this tendency. A concept you can just use. I don't know how to really transfer this idea. It's also based on a metaphor, of course, but there is nothing information program code. It's one-handed, one's monosemic, and also the meaning is unquestionable. But where the meaning stems from, that's hidden. Where did it start? What is its history? Where does it get its power? That is hidden, not to be mentioned. This is, of course, the tendencies we see in the other text, where someone tries to build up a one-sidedness and make a causal chain, do all those things that makes for staticness, hiding in order to reveal something, but thereby covering the truth. It's no Lichtung, to use a Heideggerian phrase. It's no opening. It's the opposite. Obscuring. And possibly for a reason the obscurer himself are not aware of. Doesn't know what big game he's playing in. That's my suspicions. Way to Kalle, maybe some views here. Please speak directly into the microphone. You were really clear.
Yes, let's go to page 69. 69.
Yes.
Here. Yes. Middle of the page. No, it's not middle of the page. It's rather in the here. Let me see.
Yes. I thought
so between sickness and health, there are only differences of degree. Blah 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 blah. So why I'm taking up this? I had a discussion with the Swedish quantum physicist Anna Imren. And he about Schrödinger's cat. Anna Imren says that in this superposition, the cat is 100% alive or 100% dead. My objection was, and here Derrida is on my side, what would 100% dead mean? What would 100% living mean? Because nobody is 100% living ever, never. Perhaps in Eden's paradise, perhaps.
Yeah.
And what would a person who is 100% dead mean? That is, that would be, so to say, for a Christian almost heresy. It means that there is no redemption, possibility of resurrection. That's completely like, even the smallest atoms are completely disappeared. So this is Derrida, so to say, confirming my point of view. So, but in order to speak about the Schrödinger's cat, so in the superposition, okay, the cat is dead, but only up to 90% or 80%, depending on the cat.
Okay.
And people want to draw hard borders, clear-cut borders between different things, but no borders, clear-cut borders exist in nature or anything.
Well, maybe that can be compared to original and copy, as we went into the other texts. That there's an absolute difference between the original and the copies. Just a copy, it's just a sort of lesser thing, like a photo of it. Which is, I would say, also silly nonsense and chatter. It's to use the rather strong language of Derrida. In the end, what would be an original? And the original then is the live thing, the living thing, and the copy is the dead one, which is exactly as Plato had it.
Yes, let me see, where did we have the word? Let me see if I can find it quickly like this. This word. You already mentioned this passage,
yes.
But I still want to highlight the word tampering. Is for instance, in New Testament text of criticism, they speak much about tampering with manuscripts, and that is always very, very, very negative. But we have seen in science, tampering is, you cannot avoid that tampering. Tampering is part of life.
We should actually have tampering. It's even that far in quantum physics. It's a good thing. It's they count on the observer putting his finger into the sort of the equation, whereas the classical model, you know, this glass bottle, everything is isolated inside the glass bottle, and the scientists are wearing gloves.
Absolutely.
Well, we need to know this is a modern tendency. These writer about the other text like Köster, nobody would write that 300 years ago. It's Newtonian, very influenced by that. It's this fixation with the true origin, or as you say, with life. And this is also metaphor and concept. Concept is the true thing. There's the original. The metaphor, even though it's before, Cangelham admits it's before, that Bernard had to deal and have to make do with metaphors. He admits it's before, so they dissent from metaphor, but now they are true concepts. And of course, Cangelham is saying they always been metaphors in some Platonic heaven. Not always been concepts, sorry, in some metaphoric heaven somewhere. They always existed. We just didn't know about them.
And this Heimat is a beautiful word. So we had it on page 67. It speaks there till about the simile and the metaphor that they are linked to the mother. While, okay, if you want to simplify, let's say for the sake of argument, metaphor and simile is like the mother.
Yes.
And the concept is like the father. It could work to a certain degree, but it's still concepts are dead things.
Yeah. And Cangelham wants to keep them dead as well. It's an important. He wouldn't use the expression dead, but that was what he prefers.
Absolutely.
Unchangeable, like the classical laws of physics, unchangeable.
One last thing, it was in the same paragraph you mentioned already, but we could here, let's say the word code. You can often think about numbers, like we have 66 as existing sheep.
Yes.
It seems so mathematical and scientific.
Yeah, doesn't it? Doesn't it?
But as we have discussed many times in the past, that people forget how you once learned to calculate.
Yeah.
So, for instance, you have one sheep, two sheep, you think about concrete objects.
Yeah.
And there is life in like one sheep. Sheep is alive.
Sheep is alive, and birds, apples, and we also have from Lakoff Johnson that help with the understanding, that show that mathematics comes from sheep. Yeah.
But let's say that you count dead sheep or dead, let's say rotten apples. You still have something living, the masks. It sounds ugly, but it still conveys the idea of life. Something is living there.
Yeah.
So even coals are something living. And okay, so perhaps we should end there, Hans.
Yeah, it was a rather long here. I'm going to end. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Kalle.
Thank you.
I know.